The smoke rose in silence, black, thick, biblical. It was the kind of smoke that doesn't need sound to announce death. Beneath it, the streets of Berlin smoldered like the ribcage of a slaughtered animal, and in a basement 40 feet below the Reich Chancellery, a man sat at a typewriter, writing orders that would never be obeyed. April 28, 1945. 2:17 a.m. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt's hands trembled as he typed. Not from fear, he had run out of fear 3 weeks ago, but from exhaustion. From hunger. From the bone-deep realization that he was a ghost writing orders for an army of ghosts, defending a regime that had already ceased to exist everywhere except in the delusions of the man sleeping one floor above him. The typewriter clattered in the concrete tomb. Outside, Soviet artillery hammered the city into powder. The Russians were 800 meters away. Maybe less. Distance had stopped mattering when the front lines dissolved into every street, every building, every basement where desperate men crouched with the last bullets they would ever fire. Reinhardt pulled the paper from the typewriter and read the order he'd just written. All available forces will defend the Reichstag to the last man. No retreat. No surrender. Victory or death. He stared at those words, victory or death, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not despair. Just the hollow recognition that he was about to send children to die for a fantasy. Because that's what was left of the Wehrmacht in Berlin. Children. The Volkssturm, old men with hunting rifles and boys with Panzerfausts who'd never fired a weapon until yesterday. The SS fanatics still believed. The regular army soldiers knew better, but they obeyed anyway because disobedience meant execution, and at least fighting the Russians gave you a chance. Reinhardt had been writing these orders for 11 days. Every morning, he typed commands for units that no longer existed, directed reinforcements that would never arrive, and promised relief that wasn't coming. The whole apparatus of military command had become a theater production where everyone knew their lines, but the stage was on fire and the audience had left. He was 31 years old. Before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher in Munich, history, ironically, who'd believed in duty and order and the fatherland. He'd enlisted in 1939 with genuine conviction, fought in France with professional competence, and survived Russia by learning when to follow orders and when to quietly ignore the insane ones. But Berlin was different. There was nowhere to quietly ignore anything. The madness was total, compressed into a dying city where every decision was between one kind of death and another. The phone on his desk, an actual working phone, which was itself a miracle in a city where most infrastructure was rubble, rang with a harsh mechanical shriek that made Reinhardt flinch. He lifted the receiver. Hauptmann Reinhardt. The voice on the other end was young, hoarse with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. Sir, this is Lieutenant Fischer, 9th Parachute Division Remnants. Defending the Reichstag approaches. We need. The line crackled with static and distant explosions. Sir, we need reinforcements. The Russians have broken through our forward positions. We're down to maybe 90 men, mostly Volkssturm. We can't hold another assault. Reinhardt closed his eyes. The 9th Parachute Division had been an elite formation once. Now it was 90 exhausted soldiers, half of them armed civilians who'd been handed rifles 3 days ago. Reinforcements are being organized, Reinhardt said, reciting the lie he'd been told to tell. Hold your position. Relief is coming. Fischer's voice cracked. Permission to speak freely? Granted. There are no reinforcements, are there? We both know that. The relief columns don't exist. This whole defense it's just delaying the inevitable. Reinhardt said nothing. What could he say? Yes, you're right. You're all going to die for nothing? The truth was treason. The lie was murder. Just, Fischer continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Just tell me one thing, sir. Does surrender mean execution? If we raise white flags, will they shoot us for it? The standing orders were explicit. Surrender was cowardice. Cowardice was treason. Treason meant death, usually administered by SS field police who roamed the city hanging deserters from lampposts with signs around their necks that read, I betrayed Germany. But those orders came from men who would be dead or fled within days, while Fischer and his 90 doomed soldiers were making life-or-death decisions right now. Reinhardt made a choice. Lieutenant Fischer, I am ordering you to defend the Reichstag approaches until relieved or until your position becomes militarily untenable. Do you understand? A pause. Then, quietly, yes, sir. I understand. Good. When your position becomes untenable, and you will know when that is, you will use your best tactical judgment regarding the welfare of your men. Is that clear? Another pause, longer this time. Fischer understood. Reinhardt had just given him permission to surrender without saying the word. It was the thinnest possible cover, but it was something. Crystal clear, sir. Thank you. The line went dead. Reinhardt set down the phone and stared at the typewriter. He just violated a direct order from the Führer's headquarters. If anyone had been listening, and in this paranoid bunker, someone was always listening, he'd be arrested within the hour. But something inside him had broken during that conversation. Or maybe it had been broken for weeks, and he'd just now noticed. Klaus Reinhardt had not been an unusual German soldier. He believed in duty, followed orders, and served competently without distinguishing himself as either hero or villain. He was the kind of officer armies need in bulk, educated, reliable, professional. He'd seen combat in France, where the Wehrmacht crushed Allied resistance in 6 weeks of mechanized brilliance. He'd fought in Russia, where that brilliance turned to frozen mud and endless steppe and the slow realization that Germany had invaded something too vast to conquer. He'd survived Stalingrad, not inside the pocket, thank God, but close enough to watch that catastrophe unfold through casualty reports and desperate radio messages. He'd retreated from the Caucasus, fought through Ukraine, and by 1944 found himself assigned to Berlin staff duty because chronic shrapnel wounds to his left leg had made him unsuitable for frontline service. Berlin was supposed to be safe. Staff work. Administrative duties. Filing reports and writing orders for units hundreds of miles away. Instead, he'd ended up in a basement command post, writing orders for the apocalypse. The city had been dying since February, when the strategic bombing shifted from factories to pure terror. The RAF and USAF were running out of industrial targets, so they'd started burning residential areas instead. Women, children, old men, everyone became legitimate targets in the doctrine of total war. Reinhardt remembered walking through a neighborhood in Charlottenburg after a bombing raid, seeing a child's shoe in the rubble, just one shoe, and wondering with detached academic curiosity what had happened to the child who'd worn it. His mind wouldn't let him imagine. It just shut down, filed the image away, moved on. That's what combat did to you. It taught you to stop feeling, stop imagining, stop connecting objects to the human beings they belong to. You became efficient at processing horror because the alternative was becoming paralyzed by it. But Berlin had ground that numbness away. There was too much death, too much pointless waste, too many children in Wehrmacht uniforms who still had baby fat in their faces. The Volkssturm were the worst. Old men who'd fought in the First War and boys who should have been in school, handed rifles and told to stop the Red Army. They didn't even have proper uniforms, just armbands and desperation. Reinhardt had watched them shuffle past his command post window last week, a column of maybe 200 being marched to defensive positions. The old men moved with grim resignation. They remembered Verdun. They knew what was coming. But the boys, God, the boys, they still had something like excitement in their eyes. They'd been fed a decade of propaganda about Germanic superiority and warrior culture. They thought they were about to become heroes. Reinhardt knew they'd be dead within a week. And he was helping kill them by writing orders that pretended this defense meant something. The official fiction in April 1945 was that Berlin could be held. That General Wenck's 12th Army would break through from the west. That Steiner's SS divisions would attack from the north. That these relief forces would link up, encircle the Russians, and turn defeat into victory. Everyone in the bunker, from Hitler down to the lowest clerk, clung to this fiction because the alternative was admitting that Germany had lost, that everything they'd fought for was ashes, that the 6 years of war had been for absolutely nothing. The maps in the command center still showed neat arrows indicating where relief forces would attack. The briefings still included confident assessments of enemy weakness and German strength. The orders still referenced objectives and strategic considerations as if this were a normal military operation instead of death throes. Reinhardt had stopped believing any of it around April 20th, Hitler's birthday. That was the day he'd seen the casualty reports from the actual units, Not the inflated numbers reported upward to maintain morale, but the real counts. The 12th Army that was supposed to relieve Berlin had maybe 40,000 effective troops, most of them undertrained and poorly equipped. They weren't an army, they were a collection of training units, stragglers, and last-ditch formations thrown together in desperation. Steiner's SS divisions didn't have the fuel to move, and even if they did, they'd be attacking through Soviet-controlled territory with no air cover and no artillery support. The whole relief operation was fantasy. But orders kept being issued as if it were real, and soldiers kept dying as if their deaths would matter. After Fischer's call, Reinhardt couldn't stop thinking about those 90 men at the Reichstag. 90 lives that would be thrown away defending a building that no longer meant anything to anyone except as a symbol. He pulled out the latest intelligence summaries. The Russians were 800 meters away. Their artillery could hit any position in the government quarter. They had air supremacy, armor superiority, and approximately 2.5 million soldiers encircling Berlin. The Germans had maybe 45,000 combat-effective troops left in the city, a third of them Volkssturm civilians, running out of ammunition, food, and hope. The mathematics were inescapable. Berlin would fall within days. The only question was how many would die first. Reinhardt's phone rang again. Hauptmann Reinhardt. This is Oberleutnant Meissner, Defensive Sector 4, Alexanderplatz. I need authorization to withdraw my forces. We're cut off, surrounded, and under heavy fire. If we stay here, we'll be annihilated. Request permission to break out and rejoin defensive lines near the zoo station. Reinhardt checked his maps. Sector 4 was already deep behind Soviet spearheads. Meissner's unit, probably 100 men at most, was trapped in a pocket that served no strategic purpose. Holding the position wouldn't slow the Russian advance by even an hour. The official order was clear. All units hold their assigned sectors. No retreat. No withdrawal. Reinhardt looked at the typewriter. At the phone. At the concrete walls that felt like a tomb. He made another choice. Oberleutnant Meissner, what is your unit strength and combat readiness? We've got 87 men still fit for combat. Maybe half have adequate ammunition. We've been fighting for 36 hours straight. The men are exhausted. And if you remain in your current position, how long can you hold? A pause. Honestly, sir? Maybe 2 hours before we're overrun. We're serving no tactical purpose here. We're just dying slowly. Reinhardt closed his eyes and thought about duty. About orders. About 87 men who would die for nothing if he said the wrong words. Oberleutnant, your position is no longer tenable for effective defense. You are hereby authorized to conduct a fighting withdrawal to Zoo Station, preserving your force for continued operations. Execute immediately. Acknowledge. Sir, Meissner's voice cracked with relief. Acknowledged. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You still have to make it out. Good luck, Oberleutnant. Reinhardt hung up and immediately wrote the order into his log, backdating it and phrasing it in careful military language that made the withdrawal sound like tactical repositioning rather than retreat. It was the second time in an hour he'd violated standing orders. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. Over the next 48 hours, Reinhardt's phone kept ringing. Officers calling from hopeless positions, requesting permission to withdraw, to surrender, to do anything except keep fighting a battle everyone knew was lost. And Reinhardt kept finding bureaucratic language to authorize it. Tactical repositioning to prevent encirclement. Strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. Preservation of forces for continued operations. Every call was another violation. Every order was treason technically. But Reinhardt couldn't stop. Because every authorized withdrawal was 50, 100, 200 men who might survive. Who might make it to Allied lines and live through the war instead of dying in the rubble of a city that was already dead. He kept meticulous records, documenting everything in proper military format. If he was going to be arrested and shot, and he probably was, at least there would be a record of what he'd tried to do. But something strange happened. The arrests didn't come. Reinhardt realized that the chain of command had fractured so completely that nobody was monitoring his orders anymore. The SS field police were busy hanging deserters. The senior officers were either fled or drunk or hiding. The communication networks were breaking down. In the chaos of Berlin's collapse, one staff captain quietly countermanding suicidal orders went unnoticed. He was a ghost, writing orders for ghosts, in a regime that had already ceased to exist except in the death spasms of fanatics. He started keeping a private list. Not official, just names and units. Fischer at the Reichstag. Meissner from Alexanderplatz. Hauptmann Weber from the Tiergarten. Lieutenant Koch from Tempelhof. Every officer he'd given permission to withdraw. Every unit he'd quietly told they could stop dying. The list grew longer each day. 10 units. 20. 50. Reinhardt had no illusions about what he was doing. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even particularly brave. He was just a bureaucrat with a typewriter who discovered that the machinery of obedience had broken down enough that one man could insert a little mercy into the gears. Most of the officers who called him were desperate, exhausted, beyond caring about regulations. They just wanted someone to tell them it was okay to stop, that they'd done enough, that their duty was fulfilled. And Reinhardt gave them that. Not because he was courageous, but because he couldn't keep lying. Couldn't keep sending men to die when the war was already lost. On April 29th, the phone calls started coming faster. The Soviet ring was tightening. Units were being overrun hourly. The desperate requests multiplied. Reinhardt worked through the night, writing authorizations, documenting withdrawals, giving permission for soldiers to save themselves. His hand cramped from typing. His eyes burned from exhaustion and concrete dust that sifted from the ceiling with each artillery impact. But he kept working because the phone kept ringing, and on the other end were men who would die if he told them to hold their positions. Around 3 a.m. on April 30th, the building shook so hard that Reinhardt was thrown from his chair. A near miss, maybe 50 meters away. The lights flickered and died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in sickly yellow. The phone rang in the darkness. He fumbled for the receiver. Hauptmann Reinhardt. Sir, this is Lieutenant Fischer. Reichstag sector. You may remember we spoke 2 days ago. I remember. What's your situation? The Russians have overrun our positions. We're down to 23 men, no ammunition, no food, no medical supplies. We've been fighting for 3 days straight. Sir, Fischer's voice broke. We want to surrender. We've done everything we could. But if we raise white flags, the SS will shoot us before the Russians even see them. Reinhardt looked around the empty command post. Most of the staff had fled yesterday. The senior officers had vanished. Even the phone lines were mostly dead. In the bunker 1 floor up, Adolf Hitler had reportedly shot himself hours ago, though official announcements were still calling him the Führer as if he were alive and commanding. The regime that had issued all those death-before-surrender orders no longer existed. But the SS field police still had bullets, and they were still executing soldiers for cowardice. Lieutenant Fischer, listen carefully. I am issuing you a direct order. You will assess whether continued resistance serves any military purpose. If you determine it does not, you will take appropriate action to preserve your remaining forces. Do you understand? Sir, yes. I understand. Thank you. One more thing, Fischer. When this is over, when they ask you why you surrendered, you tell them Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt gave you a direct order. You put it all on me. Understood? Yes, sir. I won't forget this. Good luck, Lieutenant. You did your duty. Now go survive the peace. Reinhardt hung up and sat back in his chair. The building shook from nearby artillery impacts. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere above him, the Third Reich was burning itself to ash. He'd saved maybe a few thousand men. Not enough. Never enough. But something. He pulled one final sheet of paper into the typewriter and began writing his last order. To all remaining units under Berlin command. Effective immediately, all defensive positions are authorized to conduct tactical withdrawals as local commanders deem necessary to preserve forces and prevent unnecessary casualties. Commanders will use their best judgment regarding the welfare of their men. The defense of Berlin has been conducted with extraordinary courage and determination. Those who have fought here have fulfilled their duty to the utmost. No further sacrifice is required. Klaus Reinhardt, Hauptmann, Wehrmacht General Staff. He typed it, signed it, and placed it on his desk where it would be found. Then he stood, put on his coat, picked up his pistol, not to fight, just to have, and walked out of the bunker into a Berlin that no longer existed. The streets were unrecognizable. Buildings he'd walked past for months were now skeletal ruins. Fires burned everywhere, casting dancing shadows on rubble. The smell was indescribable, cordite and burning wood and death, always death. Reinhardt walked west, away from the Soviet advance, through streets clogged with refugees and deserters and soldiers who'd given up pretending there was anywhere to defend. No one stopped him. No one asked for papers or questioned his authority. The machinery of military discipline had dissolved. Everyone was just trying to survive the next hour. He made it to the Tiergarten, or what remained of it. The park had been reduced to a moonscape of craters and splintered trees. Somewhere in the darkness, men were still fighting, small arms fire crackling sporadically. Reinhardt found a crater and sat down, back against cold earth, pistol across his knees. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Dawn maybe. Or Soviet soldiers. Or the simple fact of having survived this long. He thought about the men he'd given permission to surrender. Fischer and his 23 survivors at the Reichstag. Meissner's 87 from Alexanderplatz. All the others whose names he'd written in that private list. Most of them were probably dead by now. Killed in the withdrawal or cut down by SS field police or simply caught in the grinding chaos of Berlin's collapse. But some had made it. Had to have. Maybe only a few dozen. Maybe a few hundred. Reinhardt had spent the war following orders, believing that duty and obedience were virtues. And they were, until the orders became insane and obedience became murder. He'd violated his oath. Disobeyed direct commands. Committed what the regime would call treason. And he'd do it again. Would do it 1,000 times over. Because there was a higher duty than obedience to orders. A duty to preserve life when death served no purpose. To recognize when courage became stupidity and discipline became suicide. The phone calls had taught him that. All those desperate officers looking for permission to stop, to withdraw, to admit the battle was lost. They'd needed someone to tell them it was okay. That they weren't cowards. That survival wasn't betrayal. And Reinhardt had given them that. One conversation at a time. One unauthorized order at a time. It wasn't heroism. It was just refusing to participate in pointless death. Dawn came slowly, gray and cold. The artillery fire slackened. Soviet forces were consolidating their positions, preparing for the final push. Reinhardt stood, legs stiff from the cold crater. He holstered his pistol and started walking again, heading west, toward whatever remained of German lines. He didn't know if he'd be arrested or ignored. Didn't know if those orders he'd written would be discovered and condemned or simply lost in the chaos. Didn't matter really. Because somewhere in the rubble of Berlin, some men were alive who would have been dead if he'd followed orders. And in the end, that was enough. Klaus Reinhardt survived the war. He surrendered to Soviet forces on May 2nd, spent 3 years in a POW camp in Ukraine, and returned to Germany in 1948 to a country that barely resembled the one he'd left. He never spoke publicly about the orders he'd written in those final days. The records were lost or destroyed, and most of the men he'd saved never knew that one staff officer had quietly given them permission to live. He went back to teaching, this time in Hamburg. History again, because someone had to teach the next generation what happened when duty became madness and patriotism became poison. His students knew he'd been a Wehrmacht officer, but nothing more. He didn't discuss the war. Didn't tell stories or display medals. Just taught history with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested personal knowledge of how badly things could go wrong. In 1982, a historian researching Berlin's final days tracked Reinhardt down. Soviet archives had been partially opened, and among captured Wehrmacht documents was Reinhardt's final order, the one authorizing withdrawals when official policy still demanded death before surrender. The historian wanted to interview him, to understand what had driven a staff officer to violate direct orders in the regime's final hours. Reinhardt agreed to one meeting, in his small Hamburg apartment, surrounded by books and the quiet order of a life rebuilt from ashes. They were soldiers doing their duty, he said. Someone had to tell them their duty was done. But you violated orders. Risked execution. Why? Reinhardt was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at Hamburg's rebuilt streets. Because the orders were wrong. Because following them would have killed men for no purpose. Because sometimes duty means knowing when to stop obeying. He paused, then continued. I wasn't brave. I was just tired of writing death sentences. Of sending boys to die for a regime that had already lost. Of participating in mass suicide disguised as military necessity. The phone calls made it real. These weren't abstract strategic decisions. They were men, terrified and exhausted, asking permission to survive. And I gave it to them because I couldn't do otherwise. The historian asked how many men Reinhardt thought he'd saved. I don't know. Kept some records, but they were lost. Maybe a few hundred. Maybe a few thousand. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Did you ever hear from any of them? The men you gave permission to surrender? A few. Over the years. Letters thanking me. One man visited, told me I'd saved his life, that he'd gone home to his family because of that phone call. Reinhardt smiled, a sad, distant expression. Most I never heard from. Don't know if they made it. But I choose to believe some did. Have to believe it, otherwise those final days meant nothing. The interview was published in a small historical journal. It got minimal attention. By 1982, the world had moved on from Wehrmacht officers and their wartime decisions. But among historians of Berlin's final battle, Reinhardt's story became a quiet footnote. The staff officer who'd given unauthorized orders to withdraw, who'd quietly undermined the regime's suicidal last stand. Not a hero. Not even particularly remarkable. Just one man who'd chosen mercy over orders when the cost of obedience became too high. Klaus Reinhardt died in 1991, having lived long enough to see German reunification. Long enough to see his country rebuilt into something better than what he'd fought for. His obituary mentioned that he'd been a Wehrmacht officer and a teacher. It didn't mention the phone calls, the orders, the quiet rebellion against madness. But in Hamburg's military museum, there's a small exhibit about the final days of Berlin. And on one wall, in a glass case, is a single typewritten order dated April 30th, 1945. It's yellowed with age, crumpled from being recovered from rubble, barely legible. But you can still read the signature at the bottom. Klaus Reinhardt, Hauptmann, Wehrmacht General Staff. The museum placard explains that this order, found in Soviet archives decades after the war, represents one officer's attempt to save lives when official policy demanded death. It doesn't call him a hero. Doesn't inflate his actions into something grandiose. Just notes that in war's final chaos, some men found ways to preserve life in the midst of mandated death. And sometimes that quiet mercy mattered more than all the grand strategies and final stands. The smoke rose in silence above Berlin, black and biblical. Beneath it, the city burned. But somewhere in that fire, a few thousand men lived because one ghost with a typewriter chose mercy over orders. And in the end, that quiet rebellion, one man writing unauthorized permissions to survive, mattered more than all the heroic last stands and glorious sacrifices. Because wars are won with courage. But they're survived with compassion. And sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is tell other soldiers their duty is done. Even when orders say otherwise. Even when the regime demands death. Even when obedience has become the enemy of life itself. Klaus Reinhardt understood that. And for the men who made it home because of a phone call and a quietly violated order, that understanding meant everything.